on those cuffs. That killer is absolutely not Patrick Baker, according to scientific evidence in this case. But it's not just science that excludes Patrick from committing the shooting that we're talking about. It's also the original descriptions given by eyewitnesses. These are impartial and objective people. The victim's own mother and child described a shooter with brown eyes and tattoos. As you can see, Patrick is a blue-eyed person, and I will represent to you that he has no tattoos. And you won't find a single person in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that will dispute that. Go look at the Department of Correction records. Patrick has no tattoos, and he never has. There is an alternate suspect out there who we believe killed Donald Mills. And we would urge for a law enforcement agency to actually investigate that person and bring closure to the victim's family in this case. They deserve justice, but they are not the only ones that deserve justice, because Patrick spent 5 years incarcerated for a murder he didn't commit, and then in what should have been one of the most happy moments of his life, where his family finally had him home for the holidays, something horrific happened in the Commonwealth of Kentucky because of the person who exonerated Patrick, Governor Bevin. There were assumptions made here based upon Patrick's family supporting Governor Bevin. They voted for him in his first election. They supported him through his re-election efforts. And once you all are able to speak to people who were actually involved in investigating Mr. Baker's pardon application, you'll determine on your own, through objective evidence, that there was a legitimate investigation conducted into Patrick Baker's pardon application, that he was actually questioned extensively for several hours by a member of this government, and I think you'll find that other people were questioned as well. And Jackie Steele, the Commonwealth attorney from Knox County, he knew about this, but he knew about some other things too. In March of 2018, my law firm was representing 3 plaintiffs in 2 separate lawsuits, Amanda Hoskins and Jonathan Taylor. And that was a lawsuit against Knox County, the Barville Police Department, and Kentucky State Police officers, including Jason York and Brian Johnson. At that same time, our law firm, Lovie & Lovie, represented William Anderson in a separate lawsuit against those same KSP officers and against the Knox County Sheriff's Department. There were depositions taken in those cases, particularly of Detective Jason York and Detective Brian Johnson. And those are 2 of the detectives who investigated Patrick Baker's case beginning in 2014. In March of 2018, it was requested that we produce deposition transcripts and whatever evidence we had by a member of the government, somebody in the Justice Cabinet here named Denny Butler, so that people in this state could investigate these Kentucky State Police officers for framing innocent people for murder. And we gave deposition transcripts and evidence showing that falsified affidavits were given, that perjurious testimony was given, and that there was a witness in one of those cases that was literally charged with murder. And Detective Jason York admitted at a deposition under oath that he never informed the prosecutor, Jackie Steele, that he charged this woman with murder, and that he struck a deal with her attorney that if she implicated my client, Jonathan Taylor, that she would get to leave. And she did. And her arrest warrant and the criminal complaint never was made part of the Commonwealth attorney's file. Now, Jackie Steele ultimately dismissed that case, but significant evidence was produced from our law firm to Mr. Butler for the purposes of an investigation taking place in the Justice Cabinet and hopefully at the Kentucky State Police into whether these officers should be charged with not only violating the constitutional rights of citizens in the state, but whether they should be criminally charged for committing perjury and obstruction of justice. That was in March of 2018. What you'll find when you actually look at Mr. Baker's pardon application is that he didn't apply for a pardon until after that date. We had nothing to do with Mr. Baker's pardon efforts. And Denny Butler, as a member of the Justice Cabinet, was looking into into these officers' misconduct from the Kentucky State Police before Patrick ever filed for a pardon application, before his family ever held a fundraiser. It had absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think when you talk to Denny Butler, who used to be a state representative, who actually worked at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department for more than a decade of his life. He worked at the Louisville Police Department in the mid-2000s and was the sergeant of the cold case unit there, where he personally led homicide investigations that led to the exonerations of Kerry Porter, who not only has been exonerated, but obtained a $7.5 million settlement. Denny Butler led to the exoneration of Edwin Chandler, who not only was exonerated in Jefferson County, but obtained an $8.5 million settlement. But Denny Butler was behind those efforts as a law enforcement officer because he knows how to investigate homicides. And Denny Butler was the person who questioned Patrick Baker with regard to this case. And I think that when you all talk to Mr. Butler, you'll find that there were conversations in the Justice Cabinet and with the former commissioner of the Kentucky State Police, Rick Sanders, about whether these officers who framed Patrick, whether they should be criminally prosecuted. And I think you'll find some interesting stuff from Mr. Tilley and Mr. Sanders and what efforts they took to stop a criminal prosecution. And those officers today, they're still members of the Kentucky State Police. Mr. York, he has actually been promoted to sergeant. And in our Anderson case, we actually recovered, Mr. Anderson, by the way, was tried for murder during the same period of time. It was actually the year before Patrick. He was acquitted in a death penalty case. Mr. Anderson's case was Brian Johnson's first ever homicide investigation as a lead detective. Mr. Johnson from KSP was the lead detective on Patrick's case. There's overlap between, in the two lawsuits that have been filed, and certainly if there's one in this case, that those officers would be named there, I presume, as well. But there is overlap not only between the officers, but the type of police misconduct that was occurring. So while people want to look at a fundraiser, what they should really be looking at is whether the people with badges in this state should really have those badges. And the question that should be asked is what Governor Bevin was doing within his administration to try to bring these officers where serious allegations of misconduct had been alleged, what Governor Bevin was doing to get rid of them from the Kentucky State Police. And again, this is prior to a pardon application being filed. And one of the interrogations that took place of a witness in the Anderson case, egregious misconduct is heard. And Jimmer, I'd like for you to play that, and I'm going to talk about how that relates directly to what happened with Patrick Baker's case.
You know, look at me. Yes, sir. You know that that car and Bobby was at Google's house before he got killed. You know that. And I know you know that.
I do not know that. I do not know if Bob was over there or not. All I did.
You know the car was there.
I do know the car was over there when.
No. There's no way
During the
of
day, how long was the black car sitting there?
During the day, I never seen the car there during the day. Seriously, I did not.
Did you have your head stuck in a sand pile or what?
Now, I had Brenda fix Thanksgiving supper the day before Thanksgiving. But I never looked over to pay no attention if that car was over there. I didn't.
I'm gonna put you in fucking prison because you goddamn lied to me. I'm so fucking sick.
Goddamn bullshit. You fucking lied. I tried to be goddamn ass. Fuck you. Fuck you. Fuck you. Let's put his ass in the fucking jail.
What phone?
You a
You
goddamn
were
liar.
lying. How do we got you?
Sergeant York was questioned a couple of weeks ago under oath in a federal case and said if he had the opportunity, he would do that same thing again tomorrow. Mr. York was one of the detectives who was investigating Patrick Baker's case. So when these questions are asked about why is Patrick here, Patrick is free today because DNA evidence clears him from committing the murder, because eyewitness descriptions have never matched him, and because egregious police misconduct was being looked into by Governor Bevin and people under his command, like Denny Butler. Now, why these police officers are continued to be employed is a question that only the former commissioner, Rick Sanders, can answer, or the former, or Mr. Tilley from the Justice Cabinet. And I think that Denny Butler can answer some serious questions for each of you, as the communication he had with Mr. Tilley, and where the request came from for him to look into Mr. Baker's pardon application in the first place. Mr. Tilley's representations that he didn't know about this investigation going on into Mr. Baker's case are simply false. They are absolutely false. And when we talk about this fundraiser, one thing I want to refer you all to is that you'll see a letter that was directed from the office of the governor in June of 2018 to Mr. and Mrs. John Baker. And in this letter, it wasn't from the governor himself, it was from an office of constituent services, probably for people who aren't able to find the online application adequately, and so they attach the application to this letter. And in here it says, please be aware the completion and submission of this application means only that your request for pardon will be considered, not that one will be granted. Patrick Baker's case was treated like any other pardon in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and that's why it was granted. It wasn't a fundraiser. Frankly, if you were going to pay off somebody who's a politician, you probably wouldn't do it in a formal way where you disclose that to anybody in the state who wants to go on the government website and find out that you had a fundraiser. Probably not the best way to pay off a politician. There is absolutely nothing inappropriate about the Baker family supporting Mr. Bevin's re-election efforts. And even though citizens in Kentucky decided not to re-elect Mr. Bevin, it doesn't mean that what he did with his pardons, and especially in this case, was unjust. And in fact, what we think Mr. Bevin did here is justice at its best. And it is what an executive power is supposed to do, is that when the Knox County court system failed Mr. Baker, and when the appellate courts failed Mr. Baker, the only option he had left was turning to a governor with courage, with an executive power. And that's absolutely what happened here. There's something that I also want to talk about, which nobody has talked about yet. When the Knox County Commonwealth Attorney says, or when the Knox County judge who oversaw this case, David Williams, says it's one of the strongest cases he's ever seen, I believe was a quote that I saw out there. I hope that you all would look at what Mr. Baker was originally charged with, murder, and consider the fact that he was never convicted of murder. He was convicted of reckless homicide. And the jury, with the separate counts, recommended that those counts be consolidated and run concurrently, and that he only served 12 years in prison. This was a compromised jury verdict from Knox County. This wasn't a strong case, and if things were done differently on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Baker would have never been wrongfully convicted in the first place. We shouldn't be here today because those KSP officers should have never been in a position to have Mr. Baker wrongfully convicted. And we shouldn't be here today under the allegations that have surfaced in this case. Mr. Baker's family did absolutely nothing wrong. They have incredible names in their community, and they built some serious lives where their reputations have been tarnished, all because they supported a politician and they had a loved one who was wrongfully convicted. And only through Governor Bevin's courageous actions, through his recognition of the DNA and the eyewitness descriptions, and the recognition that these police officers that have been sued repeatedly should not have a badge, by him taking a deep look, which people around here should do, to see how many other people may be framed for crimes they didn't commit. Only through that type of consideration is why there was a pardon here based on Mr. Baker's actual innocence. Now, Patrick has a few words that he wants to share with you all about his experience and what it's like to be wrongfully convicted and to come home.
Hi, thank you all for coming today. Sorry I'm a little under the weather, but I think he's covered pretty much everything as far as the criminal part of it goes, but I'd like to thank Mr. Bevan for looking into this, and all the people behind the scenes that actually dug into this, done their own investigations. Hopefully you all maybe can look into that a little bit too. I am innocent. I want to thank Mr. Bevan for his courageous actions and allowing me to come home to my family. It's been a long journey. It's been rough, but yeah, I'm glad. And maybe, and like I said, the pardon was never paid for by my family. That's something you all, I mean, common sense can kind of tell you that, but you're more than welcome to look into that. So, but thank you. Hopefully y'all can give me my privacy. I'm gonna kind of duck out now, so thank you all.
One thing that we're calling on is for Governor Beshear to authorize his Attorney General, who I believe got sworn in today, to conduct an investigation into members of the Kentucky State Police officers, specifically the ones that have been sued in the cases that we've cited to, and in relation to Mr. Baker's case, to see whether these officers should be criminally charged with violating the laws of Kentucky and the constitutional rights of its citizens. That is something that the Baker family hopes can happen, so that the victims in those cases can get closure, and so that nobody else in Knox County and Laurel County and Harlan County and all those counties under Post 10 and Post 11, so that none of those victims' families get re-victimized by having a false belief that somebody was rightfully convicted when the real murderer was left to roam the streets. And that's exactly what has repeatedly happened, including here and including these other homicide investigations. With that, we're happy to answer questions.
So, State Police Commissioner Rick Sanders, what was his reaction when confronted with what Denny Butler found?
I think you should speak to Mr. Butler. I was not a part of that conversation. What I could tell you is that Mr. York and Mr. Johnson are still members of the Kentucky State Police. They haven't been fired. And I think that when you do FOIA requests for members of the Kentucky State Police personnel files, you'll find an interesting series of events that occurred 2 days after Jackie Steele's deposition in the Hoskins case as it relates to Detective York. And Mr. Sanders will have some knowledge about that. I can't disclose the underlying substance of what those documents are, but you should dig.
Did Sanders disagree with what Butler said, or did he say he couldn't do anything about it?
You should ask Denny. I think that Mr. Butler will be willing to shed light on what happened behind the scenes with regard to this pardon and a few others that he was involved in investigating.
Elliot, what's new now? You mentioned DNA and you mentioned the alleged wrongdoing of York and Johnson. Did Mr. Baker's defense team not have that information when he was originally tried?
I think that it could have been used better. I do think there was some destruction of evidence that happened prior to the original trial that the judge actually found to be in bad faith by Kentucky State Police officers. There are some issues on that around appeal. In terms of what's new, there is some new evidence that occurred that I'm aware of that occurred during Mr. Butler's looking into this case. And it relates to one of the other co-defendants who pled guilty. I can't really say more than that, but perhaps Mr. Butler can.
Are you claiming wrongdoing by those two police officers in this case?
Absolutely.
What about the
So what specifically are you saying that those two officers did wrong in this case in the Baker case?
I'm saying that if those officers, in this case, had investigated it properly, and it's not just them, but other members of their team, if this case had been investigated properly, Patrick Baker would have never been charged with murder. I think that there was evidence that was destroyed from
Are
a
you
cell
talking
phone.
about the cell phone
I am.
evidence?
Yes.
So, but that came up in the appeals decision, and the Court of Appeals ruled that that didn't make a difference, and they.
The court, sure, and the Court of Appeals did not reverse the lower court's, the verdict, but that's different than saying that it's acceptable. What I'll also say is that we are uncovering in these other federal lawsuits evidence of additional misconduct every day. And constitutionally, Mr. Baker would have had a due process right to that evidence prior to his trial. And it certainly wasn't disclosed, and that was, there was some argument about that. For further allegations, what these police officers did wrong here, you know, the family is considering legal options. One of those options would be a lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, I imagine that we would lay out exactly how Patrick Baker was framed for murder.
And the co-defendant was the one who said that Patrick did it. Are you saying that the co-defendant was lying when he said that Patrick did it?
Absolutely.
Do you think that prosecutor Jackie Steele should also be investigated for any criminal wrongdoing?
What I will tell you, if you look deep in Jackie Steele's deposition, is that when we sued in Amanda Hoskins' case, when we filed that lawsuit, one of the first people that Jason York sent a text message to was Jackie Steele, asking for who he should hire as a civil defense attorney, and Jackie Steele gave that recommendation. So I'm not calling for any criminal investigation of Jackie Steele. What I am saying is that Jackie Steele, given this text message and the fact that he hasn't done anything to change the way that things are being done in his county, is not an impartial prosecutor that should be responsible for investigating these police officers. And for that reason, we think that the Attorney General needs to step in.
Do you think he's a crooked prosecutor?
I think that, you know, I'm not gonna call Jackie Steele a crooked prosecutor. What I would say is that he got it wrong in this case, and that I think that prosecutors under Rule 3.8 in Kentucky have an ethical obligation to prosecute police officers for perjury and official misconduct, and that it has not been done with regard to any officers in these cases. Jackie Steele admitted under oath in a deposition that information that Detective York put in a search warrant was false. That search warrant was under oath. He also admitted that he was never informed that Detective York charged a witness with murder, that criminal complaint was never given to him, and that the $1 million bond that was assigned to it was not known to him, and that he had no idea throughout the 5 years he prosecuted these 3 people for murder, Amanda Hoskins, Jonathan Taylor, and William Lester, he had no idea that this cop had charged a witness with murder. That is shocking misconduct, and that's something that an Attorney General here should look into, so that members of the Kentucky State Police that are doing these types of things do not put people like Patrick and Amanda and Jonathan and William in a position where they could be wrongfully convicted.
Do you think that there's any criminal wrongdoing within the Kentucky State Police beyond just those 2 officers who are involved in this case?
So we've sued a number of officers outside of Johnson and York, and you know, the briefs that we filed publicly explain why. What I'll tell you is that one of the supervisors in the Hoskins case admitted that, you know, she doesn't give any supervision. It was a supervisor. She actually was involved in this case as well, but she doesn't supervise people under her. On homicide cases, she doesn't give direction to detectives under her command because she doesn't have any experience investigating homicides. And that recording that you all heard earlier, where a chair is being thrown at a wall, where a witness is being threatened, where Detective York admits to hitting a hat off the witness's head, the supervisor admitted under oath that she was watching that, and she didn't disagree with anything that happened in there. So yeah, it's a much more broad problem than just these 2 officers. I think the Kentucky State Police, what we've shown in these lawsuits and what's happened with Patrick, is an organization that needs to have a complete restructuring And that, hopefully, now that there's a new commissioner, hopefully that commissioner, will look deep into things and get rid of police officers that shouldn't be there.
Mr. Baker, when you got word that you were gonna be a free man, describe your reaction to us.
Disbelief, I think. Still kind of in disbelief. Guess it's kind of like a dream almost, I guess. Kind of playing out there. I mean, hopefully this will kind of die down and I can kind of go on with my life, I guess. But yeah, it was definitely, disbelief. That was about all I could say.
Did you think it was going to happen?
I try to stay positive, I ain't gonna lie, but, yeah, after, locked up for a couple of years or whatever, it's a little rough, but, yeah, I tried to stay positive. I was hoping for something, like I said, through the appeals court or something like that, so finding out the pardon, it was a wonderful surprise and, I guess a great early Christmas present.
Prior to the donation that your parents gave, that we've all been talking about now, had they donated to Bevan's campaign in the past?
The family, I don't know the answer to that question. What I will say is that the family did vote for Bevan originally. They've supported him throughout his election efforts, and that the donation that happened was completely unrelated to the eventual pardon. And I think when you all talk to Mr. Butler, as I've talked about a little bit today with the timeline, March of 2018 is when people in the Justice Cabinet were presented with evidence relating to these KSP officers. I think what you'll find is that about a year later is when Mr. Butler was asked to look at this particular pardon application, and that's when he realized that York and Johnson, these people who he was advocating for an investigation, that they were involved in this case.
I don't know if you have an exact answer, but the reason we're here today is because Bevan did pardon him, and now you're calling on Bashir to start an investigation into these KSP officers. If he had not gotten pardoned, would the evidence, in your opinion, still be as strong? Where would we be at in the case? Would you be asking for the same thing?
I think we have asked, if I had the power to call a governor in this state, and he would actually pick up the phone, or she would pick up the phone, every day I would call and ask for a criminal prosecution of police officers in Kentucky who are framing people for crimes they didn't commit. Absolutely. Would you all care to listen to us today if Patrick didn't get a pardon and these allegations weren't made? I think that's a different question. But what we're doing through these lawsuits is trying to expose misconduct that nobody's ever really learned about before with regard to KSP. So yes, I would. I don't know if anybody would listen.
Mr. Slosser, how did you get involved with this case? And also, did you have an array of people you were seeking clemency for based on your own knowledge of misconduct that was accepted or not accepted?
Sure. So with this case, it's privilege how I came into it, so I can't get into that, and I apologize. But what I'll say is I didn't have anything to do with the pardon efforts.
Okay.
We did, one of Amy and I, Ms. Staples and I, one of our clients was exonerated through a pardon, Keith West. And we had an evidentiary this summer where many of your organizations covered. And Denny Butler testified at that hearing. And, in that case, there's a Louisville police officer who's currently facing criminal charges for the destruction of evidence in that very case. So Governor Bevan did an incredible thing for Keith West, and we went to court first, just like Patrick did. We tried to do it that way, and a judge in Jefferson County didn't have the courage to do the right thing, even though we had a prosecutor who was very high up under Attorney General Bashir. We had an assistant attorney general testify for us that he would never put this detective, Mark Handy, on the stand again because of the allegations of misconduct that happened. We had eyewitnesses come up there and say what Mr. Handy did to them. We had Mr. Butler, testify. We had the trial prosecutor testify that if he had known this, he would have had second thoughts about even charging Keith West with murder, the double homicide back in the 90s. We did the right thing there. We tried to get it fixed. We were doing we filed a notice of appeal. We were ready to plow forward, and we also submitted a pardon application, and Governor Bevan did the courageous act, and Keith West has his name back.
You've stated that Mr. Baker was framed, and there are two other individuals in this particular case that are still locked up. Would you say that their being locked up also has to do with the
So here